Right, welcome back, everybody. We're just recommencing our afternoon of workshops. I suppose it's still morning, isn't it? I'm really losing track of time. Yeah. As mentioned earlier, we're just having a little bit of a change in terms of our order of workshops this morning. We were going to start with Graham Pollard and his environment strategy, but as we have external presenters, Mark and Melanie Baker-Jones with us, we thought we'd swap them around given the time constraints we had. So what I shall do is welcome to you both on behalf of councillors, but I shall pass over to Graham to introduce you more thoroughly. Lovely to have you with us.
Okay, thank you, Chair. As we'll see in our next workshop on the environment strategy, the strategic context of the environment strategy includes Council's community outcome to be environmental champions. And one of our external strategic priorities is to prepare for climate change. Now, as we'll see, climate change is one of our major environmental challenges in the environment strategy. It's likely to be a dominant issue for Council in the years ahead. So as well as helping the community to prepare, we also need to prepare ourselves, that's as staff and as decision makers. So in response to requests from members, we've engaged Tiff Whakahaere to prepare and present today's workshop on climate change and carbon emissions reduction. Mark and Melanie Baker-Jones are leaders in this space. They've been instrumental in the development of New Zealand's climate change policy, working with the Climate Change Minister. So you should be confident of being in very capable hands in this workshop. Thank you.
Sorry, just checking I'm pressing the right button. So tēnā koutou, mō te pōwhiri mai I a maua I konei e tēnā e rā. Thank you very much for inviting us here today, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and all of you as councillors. It's a really great opportunity. I'll just move to our slides, make sure I can, it should be. Just while the slides are coming up, just to give you a bit of background. So Te Whakahaere is a climate advisory services firm that Mark and I run together. We have been working with central government, local government, and also the private sector in this space in a variety of different service offerings. As Graham indicated, Mark has had extensive policy experience. We are both ex-lawyers as well. And I have a PhD which was looking at disaster risk and regulatory systems. So, you know, quite a bit of background in this space. Just our welcome slide. So for today, obviously we were approached, and I'm not sure if you can see the wording on the slide, but we were approached to give some background and to run a type of a workshop on Council's role in implementing and supporting the emissions reduction plan with reference to anticipated impacts. The idea today is we've put this into 3 sections. So Mark's going to go through some of the imperatives and the drivers. I'm going to have a look at some of the content and the emissions reduction plan. Mark's kind of the big picture, and I'm the details person. So we'll go through some of that. If you have questions or points that you'd like raised or discussed, just please feel free to let us know. The one thing that we would say, and you'll see up here on the slide, is that we're seeing that this climate journey there's no one answer. There's no single roadmap, and I'm sure you're all aware of that in your day-to-day business anyway. You know, you're thinking about, we understand how you deal with this in your communities and how you make it relevant for your communities and aligned with the outcomes that you're trying to achieve for those communities. So I'll hand over to Mark so you can start on the drivers, and thank you again.
Do I need to move that, or can you hear me? Or
you can bend it around if you want.
Okay.
Make your voice louder.
So yeah, kia ora koutou. Thank you very much again for the invitation. We've sort of got a limited time today. So what we thought we'd do is go quickly through a process that that I hope will help you come to terms a little bit with understanding about where we are in terms of climate change. And what I mean, not the physical impacts of climate change, but all those other things that climate change is bringing to our lives and our communities, and help you give you a little bit of a framework for you to start thinking about how you, as a council and an organisation, want to start responding to climate change. So it's going to be pretty short, and we're only going to be talking very high level. But what we're going to be talking about is showing you what is sort of evolving as a best practice approach to climate change. Because, rest assured, you as an organisation are in the same sort of position as a multitude of organisations, both in the private and public sector, who are now, we're hearing all the time on the news about these impact of climate change. You're getting pressed to make decisions about it. It can be really complex, but you're being forced to sort of, forced to give it attention. But probably like many organisations, you've got so many other things on that this hasn't been the key issue on your mind the whole way through. So what we want to do, and we talk a lot about in this space now about the opportunities of climate change, because for years you would have heard about the risks of climate change. And what we've found with organisations is if you focus on the risk, all you're doing, all that you feel like you're doing is you're putting out fires all the time, because you're just, it can be very overwhelming. So our major clients, even though we do work with central and local government, our major clients are financial institutions who have been pushed far ahead of everybody else to respond to this because, and I'll explain a little bit why in a minute, I suppose. But when they focused on risk, they started to founder. So the thinking now is, how do we look at climate change? How do we look at not as a risk, but as a certainty, and then look at the opportunities that arise out of that we can make out of that. Now, we're not going to tell you what those opportunities are today, because that's a huge piece of work. And that's what, that's what everyone is doing, working out what those opportunities are. But it's quite a change in mindset. So get away from that sort of fear of climate change. Okay, it's here, so what do we do now? Like the sort of thing that you do best as decision makers. I'm going to start talking briefly about the imperatives. And what I mean is that why are we having to respond to climate change? And this is not to frighten you or to, say you've got to act. But later on, we're going to talk about choosing a pathway to address climate change. And if you understand what's driving, us globally and nationally to respond to climate change, if you can understand what those imperatives are, it can help you later on choose your pathway. So hopefully that'll become clear. But the first imperative, I'll try and use this, is really, you would have heard of ESG, environmental social governance. I've got five imperatives up there, but there is actually a higher one than that. And that's just simply, it's the right thing to do to respond to climate change, because we've got, and we talk about that as being the moral imperative. I'm not going to preach to you about that, but it's about alleviating the suffering in our communities from climate change. We've only just sort of started feeling the impacts, I suppose, in our communities generally in climate change here in New Zealand. Look at Westport, South Island floods in the north. But for those people who are impacted by it, this is catastrophic. We experienced a lot in Australia through bushfires and through flooding. In Brisbane, for example, we experienced 2 lots of floods where whole communities lost everything. So for those people, it is catastrophic. And it's sort of helpful to keep an eye on that. Again, I don't have to preach to you on that. The other imperatives around the environmental issue, and this will be something that, typically where the climate conversation has been around. What's driving that environmental imperative is scientific commentary saying that if we go over 1.5 degrees post pre-industrial levels in temperature, we enter a territory where we don't really know what's going to happen. So they refer to it as catastrophic. That may not be the right word, but it's really an area of unknown. So there's a drive internationally to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees because we've got some idea of what those impacts will be. We are currently on track to go double that, to go 3 degrees. And that's why whenever you talk to a climate scientist, they're in a bit of a panic frenzy, because that's the trajectory on. Now, it looks like every year you sort of hear the story, it's getting worse and worse. And there's 2 reasons for that. So the Ipcc, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they're an international UN-based body. They gather climate science articles and journal article, peer-reviewed material They compile it, they analyze it, review it, and summarize it, and produce their reports every 5 or 6 years. The latest one, IR6, came out at the end of last year and this year in 3 parts. Now, that's telling us an even more frightening story than what we've heard in the past. 2 reasons for that. One is that things have gotten worse over time, but also we're gathering more information about what those impacts are. So, 10 years ago, when we were hearing science reports about the impacts of climate change, things like the ability of the ocean to absorb energy, but also to release it, weren't being studied. So that climate field is expanding, and we're getting more and more information. Unfortunately, it's telling us a more and more dire story. So does it sound like it's getting worse? Yes, and it is. We're also, for the first time, the UN's come out, or the Ipcc's come out and said, we're at a point where there's no going back. We've got locked in climate change. So now there's a good and bad side of that. The bad side of it is, we've got this far and we're not going to go back to the environment of what we were when we were kids. The good thing is that you don't have to treat that as a risk anymore. Your response to that is a risk, but there's some certainty there on that point. Now, it's not really it's a bit of a silver lining, but it does give you as decision makers a base point to move from. And all those other things, biodiversity loss, ecosystem loss, temperature rises. This, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this one. We've got looks like a linear temperature rise, but the impacts are not linear, they are exponential. So that's the other thing to bear in mind, is that the further we go down this path, the more of a headache we cause for ourselves. I'll jump ahead to social impacts, and it's probably something that is really going to be drawing it to your attention more than anything. We know that in any event, any disaster event, Melanie said, did her PhD around emergency and risk management, not just climate change. It's always the vulnerable that get hit first. And we're seeing that with the impacts here in New Zealand now. Those vulnerable parts of our communities are the ones that are getting hit worse through things like access to water. I learned yesterday that 21% of New Zealand doesn't have access, you probably heard it this morning, 21% of New Zealand doesn't have access to water, which we call a safe drinking water standard, which sort of surprised me with New Zealand, but, and health issues. Governance is one of the really big focuses for the private sector at the moment around climate change, because as decision makers, if the information's not coming to you, you can't make the right decision. So again, with a couple of the corporations, we've got some big governance programs. We're actually working through their systems and saying, why aren't you getting this information? Like the front offices are hearing it, but why aren't you as a decision maker hearing this information? So that's something to think about. I mean, government is good at governance, or should be good at governance, but there can be still those barriers. So that's another imperative, is to ensure that decision makers are getting the right information. One of the things that are developing around that is the lack of data and the lack of tools for decision makers. We're doing a very big project for one of the banks at the moment. It's been running for a year. It's a 3-year program to get them to address their climate risk, their financial risk, and all the time we hit barriers with data. Information's just not there. And the tools on how to interpret that information and make it meaningful. So if you're a bank, for example, you want to take that data, you've got to quantify it. You've got to turn it into a number on your balance sheet, but we're really struggling to develop tools. And weekly, these sort of things are developing internationally, but that's a real challenge. And the last one I've got up there, I'm going to do one more actually. I'm going to skip. I'm going to go to market. Market is what's really driving responses to climate change now. And we were talking earlier on about why this is becoming an issue, no longer just a Greens issue, but is becoming a Conservative national issue, National Party issue, who are really making moves around this space to address it. Because the private sector, the commercial sector, and the financial sector have recognized that there's a big risk here, and I'll explain that in a moment, and putting pressure on government to do something about it. Those market drivers are really have really transformed the way the world is responding to climate change in the last 7 years. And the last one is legal and policy. So I'll just quickly go through this because it's kind of helpful to know. Probably the key legal driver is the Paris Agreement in 2015, which set a temperature goal of 1.5 degrees. That was a massive trigger, and whoever came up with that was very, very clever and really understood our financial system, because as soon as the countries, globally agreed to cap our temperatures at 1.5 degrees, that means we had to and set a target for decarbonisation by 2050. So, get rid of carbon out of our systems, our economies by 2050. That meant that there was suddenly a financial risk appeared, a financial stability issue appeared. Because if you've got to decarbonise a global economy, unless you manage that carefully, you can start running into some bumpy periods, and you can end up with global instability or financial instability. So as soon as Paris was signed, the G20 got together. The Financial Stability Board, which is the international body established by the G20 to manage global financial stability, said, well, we've got Houston, we've got a problem here. And so they set up a group called the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. But again, apologise for the acronym. TCFD was comprised of leaders that was a bit like a Hollywood movie, the leaders from all our major financial institutions globally. So, Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, all the major reinsurers and insurers, formed a body, spent 2 years and came back and said, okay, we recognise that we've got a major market risk here. The way to handle it is to let the market know what that risk is. So the TCFD established a series of recommendations. Essentially those recommendations were that organisations must make disclosure of their financial risk, climate-related financial risk, and then the market will deal with it and manage that impact. So we'll have that we'll call a smooth transition. So this is why, Adrian Orr, RBNZ is under a lot of fire at the moment, where some people are saying, what's the Reserve Bank doing in climate change? It's because of the global pressure on all central banks to address this, to avoid that financial instability. Coming down a level in New Zealand, we have the Zero Carbon Bill, which you've heard about, and that set a climate framework for us. Now, there's a couple of things in the Zero Carbon Bill which we're going to lead on to what Melanie's talking about and why they're important for you. One is we know it set a target. So we've got a carbon emissions reduction target of all gases except for methane to zero or net zero by 2050. So this is that decarbonisation that I sort of keep talking about. That means we've got to take carbon out of our economy. And it's quite mind-blowing when you think about what that journey is. The next thing under that is that the target requires, because you've got a target, if you can imagine your Y and your X axis, this is your target, this is our emissions at the moment, we've got to get our emissions down to that target. Budgets are provided, so for all the years leading up to the 2050 when our target plates, we've got a quantity of carbon that we can emit as a country, decreasing amount down to 2050. This is just sort of bear that in mind, because it's going to come back to an example I'll give later in what Melanie's talking about. And then things like the emissions reduction plan, which Melanie will talk to, came out of that. Now, the other thing, there is a provision in there, 5ZN, of the Climate Change Response Act, which says that if you're a government decision maker, and it includes national and subnational, so local and central government, that you can take these targets into account. And you can take these budgets into account in decision making. And that was a permissive provision. We spent 6 months arguing over the wording of that across the parties. And it came out of that, the government said that's got to be permission. It shouldn't tell you to do that. However, since 2019, when that came into play, because climate change is now seen as such a big risk and such a big market risk, jurists, so the lawyers and the judges, are of a common view that even though the word says permissive, it's actually a mandatory or relevant mandatory consideration. It hasn't been tested in court yet, but bear that in mind, that there is an expectation, and if you ever, you're not saying you never will, but if it does end up, that there's an expectation that you will be taking into account the targets and budgets. I have no doubt you're going to be doing that anyway, because the whole of every other organisation is doing that. The last thing I want to talk about is the reporting. So you remember I said the TCFD said, well, all financial institutions should report on their risk. We've now put that into legislation under we call it a mandatory climate-related financial disclosure regime, where all our major financial institutions and our listed companies, so all our banks, all our large insurers, and investors have to report annually on their climate-related financial risk. Now, this is going to have repercussions, well, it is already, and through the entirety of our economy and communities, because the work we're doing now with the banks, they're going through, as I said, sorting out their governance, sorting out what their targets are, sorting out how they're going to decide where they're going to be investing and where they're not going to be investing. Very simplistically, it's shift investment away from high emitting industry, and there's a whole logic there, we won't have time to go into, but I tell you, towards low emitting industry. And over the next, and working with customers to help them do that, but you'll hear in the next 6 months, you'll start to hear announcements from these banks about those sectors that they're supporting and those sectors that are supported. They've all come out and said coal, for example, last year, we're no longer investing in coal. You'll see statements around oil and gas, you'll see statements around agriculture, you'll see statements around transport starting to filter through as the banks indicating where they're starting to see those risks and where they're going to move away. There are some of those financial institutions, not the big banks at all, but some that are just saying, okay, we're out of here, we're out of anything emitting, we're moving into low carbon, non emitting areas. So like renewable energies, for example. So we're out of, we're out of gas and we're into, wind farms and things like that. Those shifts happening. That's what's happening behind the scenes at the moment. The reporting, and why that's happening is the reporting legislation, the mandatory regime requires all these institutions from FY23, so next year's reporting period, at the end of that, to reporting on that risk. So there's quite a frenzy amongst these institutions to try and work out what their risk is and how they're going to manage it. But that's coming down. That's a really important thing for your communities. Now, sorry, a lot of information here. With that, I'm going to hand over to Melanie to talk about the emissions reduction plan.
Quite a scary big picture, bit of pressure. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so my plan today was to go through the emissions reduction plan, really to start at a high level, to have a look at some of the principles and the broad aims behind it, and then also raise the questions about how do those principles and those actions, how do they actually align with the outcomes that you're already trying to achieve for your communities, say in your long-term plan, so start stimulating some thinking. A lot of what I guess in my conversation we're looking at is this idea that at a community level, you have certain outcomes that you are trying to achieve, as Graham was talking about, environmental champions, that type of thing. As we'll identify, you've got needs in your communities that you're trying to meet, and then you've also got those pressures that are coming down from the legislation. So it's thinking about how do we put actions into place so that there's alignment with what we're needing to meet at the top level, alignment with what we are trying to achieve, and alignment with what our community needs, and also making sure that there's not incoherence or there's misalignment. So we don't want to be doing something at a local level that might cause friction between something that central government is trying to put in place. So I'm just going to work through the emissions reduction plan through these three areas. So the ERP and some principles, looking at the relevance and application, and then I was going to have a look at one example where we could tease some stuff out. At that point as well, it might be a point where it might be something to stimulate discussion at that point, or you might want to think about it, and as we reach the end, have some discussion about it. So, that red is not very clear. So the ERP and its principles. One comment I'd say before, when I've been looking through the emissions reduction plan, you have a look around and see what people are doing globally, and you can see that some people, Canada, for example, in March had an emissions reduction plan that it's putting in place, but it's all new. It's something that everyone is trying to get their heads around. So I think we're all on this journey together. We're at the starting point. Probably the best way that we can learn is through collaboration and sharing of information of how we put this into play. In terms of the principles, Mark's already identified that we've got the budgets, we've got the emissions reduction plan, which is helping us to reduce emissions so we meet that target. So obviously that's the aim. The plan is set up so it's focused, it says, for approximately the next 15 years. Under the Act, it can focus on one budget period at a time. So what you'll see is there's a collection of documents that come with the ERP. It's the ERP, which is the massive document. There's the ERP at a glance, which is quite helpful to have a look at. There's also a table of actions that come with it, which I'm not sure you may have already seen and started to have a look through. And there's also some technical information that comes with it. The table of actions, and that's what I'll get to in a moment, it's really got a shorter term focus. And what you'll see through the ERP is it's not all new, you know, it's focusing on sectors that we all know about. So transport, energy and industry, all those sectors which are known to us. And it's also bringing in programs which are already in play and which you may already have been responding to with initiatives in your community. And we'll talk about that in a moment with the transport. Okay, so there's 5 key principles which underpin the design of the emissions reduction plan. So they are playing our part. So that's Aotearoa playing its part at an international level to help achieve a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But that's also something that can filter down to the local level when we're thinking about what actions we're putting in play, how are we playing our part in the local, in the national, and in the international. Second principle is empowering Māori. So initiatives led by Māori and for Māori. The next initiative is thinking about equitable transition. So it's thinking about well-being and it's thinking about resilience of our communities. It's about working with nature, and really the byline is that they're wanting to establish a productive and sustainable and inclusive economy. And on the slide then, these are some broad aims which are set out in the emissions reduction plan at a glance. So the idea is about having thriving households, high value exports, enhancing nature, enabling equitable transition, ensuring no one is left behind, and ensuring that government is leading by example. So I think, yeah. Oh, apologies. Thank you, sorry.
You know how many times we went through this, guys?
And we did do a spell check. Appreciate it.
Melanie like, I hate it when they've got spelling mistakes on
I know. Oh, yes. So yeah, I think that's one point when I was working through this and I was sitting there trying to be in your shoes and trying to imagine, you know, how do I start thinking about alignment and thinking about those broad outcomes that you're trying to achieve at a community level, is taking a pause and thinking about what are the principles that they're looking at a national level? Do they sit well with us? Do we do those well? Is there any divergence in what's been suggested that they're trying to achieve? You know, obviously we're trying to have thriving households in our community, but, you know, are there gaps in terms of just the broad principles even that we feel, well, perhaps we could do better on? So just from a strategic perspective, when you're thinking about the emissions reduction plan, rather than just there's a whole load of discrete actions we could do when we could do this, this, and this, it's, I think, also thinking at a principle level, are we achieving, one, that reduction in emissions, but are we also achieving the broader initiative, the broader principles and outcomes, and also those outcomes we've highlighted that are relevant for our communities. So I'll just move on to the next slide. So I'll just read this out. So as Mark has said, this slide is really about relevance. So how is the emissions reduction plan relevant to local communities and local governments? And it's really that focus on opportunity. So the transition to a low emissions economy is a significant opportunity to improve economic prosperity, lower the cost of living, restore nature, address inequality, improve living standards. And I think that's all well and good, but it's also then that's a really nice picture to have, but how do we actually achieve that? And I think, as Mark has said, you know, when he's talking about those shifts in the economy that's going to happen, some of the impacts to households that have been identified in the shift to a low emissions economy are things like, well, we want to have thriving households, but initially costs for food, for transport, and general cost of living may actually rise in the short term for some. And as you probably already have in your communities with the cost of living issues that people are facing at the moment, not only is it thinking about the discrete activities that we can do to reduce emissions, but it's also thinking about when some of those impacts that they're suggesting hit, it's how do we make sure that we've got the safety nets there for the communities as well? Because we can grab those opportunities and we can be marching towards them. Some people are going to need to transition in their jobs though. Some people are going to need to retrain. How do we help our communities seize those opportunities and do those things? So the next slide then is about application. So I don't know how many of you actually looked at the emissions reduction plan, but there's a bit of a commentary out there that says, well, this is all well and good, but how do we apply this? You know, it feels like there's more questions than answers. Obviously, as I mentioned, there's the table of actions, and the table of actions lays out actions, outcomes, lead agencies, who are the partners and stakeholders, and some timeframes as well. And if you just even do a bit of a search on that document for local government, you can pull out, I mean, I can pull out a whole list of actions that they suggest, you know, local government is either a partner or a stakeholder in. So if you're thinking about, okay, well, how do we think about what actions? There's a ton of actions out there. And really a lot of it is actually more about, well, there are all these actions out there, but what's authentic for our communities and what's actually an issue in our communities and what's actually going to have real impact in our communities. So to understand what is going to have impact, then it's also understanding, do we actually have the underlying information? And like Mark was saying, do we actually have the data to help us understand what the emissions profiles are of our communities? If we put an electric bus in, how many people are actually going to use it? How many people, you know, if we, and I know it's not necessarily you who's delivering each part of it, but you're thinking, and we'll get to this in the transport, am I a stakeholder or am I a partner? Is there an opportunity here that I can grasp onto? Is it going to help reduce emissions? And is it also going to provide, you know, help thriving communities and all of those outcomes that you're trying to achieve locally? So it's more of a strategic focus rather than just, yes, we could put EV charging stations in, yes, we could do this and this and this, but is it actually going to have impact? And is it going to be cost effective? And actually, at a regional level, is there already a program that's going on that we could leverage off? And do I know about those? And do I know if I should be collaborating with someone so that, or, and we'll get again to the transport one in a moment, you know, things that you've done historically that there's been some really positive uptake for in the community. It's why did that work? What did we do that made it work? You know, we've been successful in some of these areas. It's not all brand new, but then it's, well, how can we take that and build on the momentum? And actually, although it might be a nice thing to do, is it actually going to have the impact on reducing emissions that we want it to have? So it's really more some of that kind of thinking. Under the, through the documents, through the emissions reduction plan, through the kind of general, I don't want to call it rhetoric, but that kind of the language that goes with all of this, a lot of it is about a change in thinking. A lot of it is about having coordinated solutions, because some of these things are going to take funding that you probably don't have right now. And some of them are a short-term focus and some of them are a long-term focus. And Mark's going to get to this in a moment. It's thinking about where are we headed? What's going to be in our short-term focus? What can we build on with other people? how can we share funds, how can we pool funds, how can we work with public and private. So for example, I used an example the other day where it was talking about EV charging stations, and I don't know who puts those in place. I don't know whether you're a stakeholder or you're a partner in that process. But, you know, in Cambridge alone, there's 3, and I talk about that because my mum and my aunt live there, there's 3 petrol stations. Do you know what those 3 petrol stations are doing in the future? Are they putting in EV charging stations? Who's going to be providing that infrastructure? If it's something, is it something national, the national government's going to do? Is it something the private sector's going to do? And where do you fit? So do you actually know where the gaps are that you're going to need to fill? And as I talked about earlier, it was also this idea of alignment and coherence. So thinking about, if you're understanding, well, if business is going to do this, if I do this, well, I'm going to be expending money that I could have used somewhere else. It's not necessarily coherent with what's going on across the full picture, and just thinking about how you bring all those actions into alignment. And so this slide here is just going back to that point that I was making before. We've got the emissions reduction plan, its aims and its principles, some themes that may be really helpful for you. In the centre, I've taken this from your long-term plan, where you're, you know, some core outcomes that you're trying to achieve. So you've got this top-down, the arrow on the side, you've got these top-down drivers or imperatives, which are saying, okay, you need to be doing something. From the bottom up, you've also got community need, and you've got, you know, you'll certainly be much more well-versed than I would in this, of what your communities need and what the gaps are. And it's thinking about how we bring all that together and align it. So just to take you through one example now. So if you go into the emissions reduction plan and you look at transport, and certainly this is only one of the examples. So you could do the same process, transport, waste, whichever area you wanted to look at. So in transport, there are a number of different actions. So in the overall picture, it's talking about integrated land use and planning and urban form. And it's thinking about, at the moment, when you're doing your spatial planning, and I think I mentioned, we were talking to Nadia about this earlier, it's at the moment when you do your spatial planning, do you have a lens over that which says, as we do our spatial planning, we're looking at emissions reduction, and we're looking at how journeys within place and between places are dealing with emissions. Is that actually something we're contemplating when we're doing our spatial planning? And maybe you are, and that's great, but it's one of the areas that they identify is, you know, so much about urban form is going to impact how people walk, whether they cycle, whether they can use scooters, whether the footpaths are okay so that elderly people can take walkers, that type of thing. So that was one of the areas. They're talking about reshaping streets, and this is something that Innovating Streets for People program, and I understand that work is already being done in this area, particularly in Cambridge, and that was something that was a success. You know, I looked on the Innovating Streets website, and it talked about how Cambridge, you know, had achieved this in one of the areas. I think it was around the schools, in terms of, so why did that work? And can you build on the momentum of that?
I think let's just interrupt you for a minute there, Melanie. Mike might have something to add on that point.
I'm not. We're probably at school, but that's not what I'm going to ask. My question is this, and it's a little bit, why is it when I go to the South Island, there is so many new petrol stations being built?
Yeah.
What do they know that we don't? like, it's a genuine question. They're all unpersoned stations.
We are focusing on electricity at the moment, but when we sat in our conference, we heard Toyota, the actual head of Toyota, talking of hydrogen. Now, hydrogen can be dispersed from a central petrol station. It'll be a refill exactly like we have now, and hydrogen can be produced in New Zealand. So we'll get away from the import. The restriction on a power or electricity is simply generation.
Yeah.
We just have not got the ability to do it with a green measure. So I would actually say to you that this is possibly the future of our industry, will be hydrogen, specifically with larger transport vehicles and also with the fact of urban mobility.
And so, and I guess that's where I'd say here, what's the opportunity then? So you're at the end of a motorway and you're going to have a whole lot of trucks potentially in the future, like these signals saying converting to hydrogen. So is there an opportunity there? Are the petrol stations there, are they already going to cater for that? Or, you know, so it's understanding what those opportunities are and thinking about how do we leverage off that? If we're at the end of the motorway and where petrol stations are going to be put in that, what are the opportunities that surround that that are relevant for our communities? So it's that type of thing. In terms of the other areas, public transport, they're talking about reach, frequency and quality. So again, it's, are you a stakeholder or a partner in the provision of public transport? It's thinking about, well, if I'm a stakeholder, but I'm not the person who's responsible for making an electric bus or putting an electric bus in place, then what opportunity is there for me to support our communities using those buses more? So it's looking at each one and where does our opportunity lie in that area. The next one then is about supporting people to walk, cycle and use public transport. So again, that's leveraging off some of those programs that are already in place, some where there's funding available for some of those programs. But again, always coming back to that question, is that really feasible and viable in our community? Is it going to be feasible and viable where, you know, if we're getting increasing temperatures in summer, how many people, like my mum and, as I said, my mum and aunt live in Cambridge, and they were talking about how hot it was over summer. Now, they're probably people there in their mid-70s, and they're not necessarily going to be out walking, certainly not cycling in the middle of summer. But it's thinking about there's other people in your community that may impact, and is the demographic of those people such that you could have a big impact on emissions? Yeah, and sorry, Mark's just reminding me of the time. So there's similar actions, and really this is just to point out that across the table of actions, there are numerous actions that have been identified that can be taken. They can be taken as a stakeholder, as a partner. It's working out then what you're going to get the bang for your buck, what's going to impact emissions. And this is then where I hand over to you, Mark. Finally, give back the microphone. Yeah, on how we achieve.
I think if we'd had more time, we probably would have gone through more detail with the ARP and some of those steps, but conscious that we don't have a lot. And, you know, and Toyota has come to us, and there's some very interesting things happening that they will use hydrogen in the communities for coming through. So very interesting. So I'm going to talk about, okay, Melanie's talked about, sort of indicated that there's a whole lot of actions out there, and you'll know this sort of thing. So what do you do with all these actions? Like, how do you choose what you should do as a community in terms of, you know, cherry picking from these actions? So we talk about climate alignment, and I'm going to explain to you what the steps means. And I hope I'm not going to be too simplistic, so forgive me if it's a bit too easy going. But again, it's really high level, and it's how organisations globally now are starting to look at what do we do given all these, and I'm going to say opportunities, all these opportunities available to us. So just take I'm going to use this as an analogy here. Again, sorry, it's like almost, I feel like it's a bit like a kid's class. But anyway, if you're in this is your office, and you imagine that you were tasked with being the safety officer. So, and you've been told, you know, you've got to get everyone out of the office when there's an emergency. So the process you go through, the first thing you're going to do is go, okay, well, you know, where's the door? So where's the door? So I know where to get everyone out. The next thing you've got to do is say, well, you know, how do I get everyone to the door? What's the best way to get everyone to the door? You know, what's the pathway to that door? And then the third thing you're going to do is say, well, how do I get everyone, you know, from their station, from their desk? How do I time it? How do I get them on that pathway to the door? Simple stuff. If we apply that to a climate change context, if we look at this and we say, all of these points here, now we're starting to look at a graph, all of these points here are the different actions that are available to you or to any organisation to take in climate change. Now, with climate alignment, the first thing we do is say, okay, well, if we've got to take all these actions, what are we trying to achieve out of this? And we come back to that first point we talked about, which is your target. Setting a target, setting a direction for you. Now, setting a target sounds like an easy thing to do. And honestly, there's many organizations that up until recently almost flippantly said, oh, we'll just do 2050 net zero and we'll work it out from there as we go through. Now, you don't have a lot of discretion actually about where your target's going to be if you're going to set a target. And it's probably possible that you probably will end up with a 2050 target, because that's what our national target is. That's what global targets are heading towards. So you don't have a lot of discretion, but don't take that lightly when you're choosing a target. You need to understand what you're getting yourself into when you're setting yourself a target. And we've dealt with a number of organizations who have just said, oh, we'll set a target and we'll sort of work out how we're going to get there later on, and realize that they've really painted themselves into a corner. So you may not have a lot of discretion. You will have to set a target because your financiers, your banks, if I get time, I'll tell you why. They're going to require you to set a target. LGFA is going to get you to set a target. You're borrowing from private banks, say, well, government's telling you to set a target. So you will have to get one, but don't take it lightly. The next thing you're going to have to do, so I'm not trying to tell you what to do, so excuse my language, but the next thing you're going to do is set a pathway. So if you look at that graph and you look at the y-axis, that's your emissions, and you look on the x-axis, that's the reduction in emissions you have to take. That pathway is how underneath that is how much carbon you have as a community to emit. Now, this is going to get too complex. I don't want to get into it, but because we know there's a price on carbon, if you emit more carbon than you have budgeted, then there's likely to be there will be a cost for that. Really simply, we can talk about that if we need to. But anyway, that's your path. Now, there are any number of pathways that you can choose to get to your target. So for example, you could just say, we're not going to reduce our emissions until 2049. And then on New Year's Eve 2049, we're just going to shut down anything that produces emission. Of course, you won't do that. And when I spoke at the beginning, this was what the FSB, Financial Stability Board, was worried about, that organizations leave it till late and then you fall off the cliff. Or you can go really early. And there's a lot of evidence out there to show that if you go early, it can be a lot less costly in terms of dollars. But there can be additional costs. It can be community costs. It can be local other impacts by going too early. But there can be you can have many ways that pathway could work. But that's what you want to have in mind, is how are we going to get to our target? How are we going to get there? The next thing you want to do is to look at all your actions that are available to you and say, how does we get that action to align with our pathway? And this is where the alignment comes in. And I'll give you an example from a bank. If you're a bank and you're in coal, you've got a coal customer, and you've set yourself a net zero target, at some point you've got to drop that coal customer, because you can't have you could feasibly have net zero coal, but that's a lot of forest you've got to offset. So you've got to drop that customer. Now, a responsible bank will be talking with the coal company and saying, okay, over time, we're going to work with you to help you transition your business out of coal into another industry. And those green lines up there are that discussion and helping you transition so that you eventually at some point align with our portfolio. Now, again, this sounds really with our pathway. This sounds simple. This is the really complex stuff that we're involved in at the moment, working with organizations to help them set those pathways. But they're fundamentally the three things: your target, your emissions pathway, and you're aligning your portfolios with that. Now, when you carry out that exercise, when you start examining those actions, and this is what Melanie was talking about, when you start looking at those actions, some of those you're going to go, we just can't align them with our pathway. It's not going to work. So those are the actions that you don't invest in, you don't spend your time on. Some of them are actually going to be easy to implement and help contribute to emissions reductions. So those are the ones you'll go through. Now, it may be for cost optimization, there may be for other reasons, there may be for community benefit. You say, we've got to really do that to look after our community. And it may be a higher cost, and you may decide, well, we have to do that early. It makes sense to do that early, so we start building that pathway in. But if you go through that exercise with all those actions available to you, and I said it's not a simple path, you'll start to see, you'll start to develop a strategy on how you address climate change. You'll also start to see when to address those climate change issues. Now, I'm going to give you an example, and it's an uncomfortable one. I was brought up in Te Awamutu too, and after I left college, went overseas, but I've got my memory of what the community was and how it's a strong agricultural community. Now, this is really recent research in the last few weeks, but I'm going to skip this with pathways. It's an important point. This is in detail. But sorry, this is just a graph to show you pretty much what the world is doing around aligning with the net zero targets. 101 on carbon. I don't know if you know how a carbon market works, but if you're a forester and you again, really crude, you grow your forest, and your forest sequesters or it sucks in carbon. So for every ton of carbon your forest sucks in, the government will give you an NZU, a New Zealand unit, because you've just taken some carbon out of the atmosphere. You can then take that unit and you can go onto the market and you can trade that on the emissions trading scheme to whoever you wants to buy it. You probably go to the the coal company and they'll say, we want to keep going for another year, so it's going to cost us to emit carbon. So we need your unit in order to have authority to emit that carbon, because we've got to then hand that unit in payment to the government. So there's this, sort of that circle happening there. With so the foresters are influenced by the price of land and the cost of carbon as to how much land they will purchase in order to grow forest. So everyone happy with that? We're that? And I'm sorry if I'm being too simplistic or too complex. This is the price of carbon. So 2014 was when it was really low, but if you look about 2020, so this is when the zero carbon bill came into play, the price of carbon was about $25 a tonne. At the moment, it's up, it sort of moves between about $70 and $80 a tonne. Now, all that change in the price of carbon has happened pretty much this year. Not just because what's happening in New Zealand, but because globally, emitters are looking for carbon credits to offset their emissions. So massive rise there. Now, why has it stopped at $70? Because, I'll show on this slide. Okay, too much information on here. This came out from an advice from the Climate Change Commission the other day to government. And if you look at the top red line at the bottom there, you'll see $70. Now, the carbon market managed through the government in order to keep the price at a certain level. If the price of carbon hits a certain level, we call it the cap, and looks like it's going to go over that, the government starts issuing more carbon units. It starts to sort of flood the market to keep the price down. So the current cap's $70. So the price of carbon has hit that cap and it's sitting around $70. The Climate Change Commission came out the other day and said to government, in order to meet our carbon budget, we actually have to get the price of carbon to $214 by 2026. So 3 years' time, we've got to list the price of carbon to that point. Okay? So what does that mean? That means, another complex one, this is a marginal abatement cost curve. Don't worry too much about it. But what this graph tells you is, and you'll see on there, it's probably really small, it's showing beef and lamb, it's showing dairy land, the quality of that land. And it tells you essentially the value of that land for use as beef and lamb or for dairy. What it doesn't tell you, but what I'll show you now, is the value of that land into relation to for use as forestry. So see the first little dotted line there just above the current, that's the current price of carbon. And if you follow that line across, any land underneath that dotted line,
the red line,
this line here,
yeah,
there's that current price. Any line under here, this is the price of carbon, sorry, from $70 today to $240. Any land under this price, which is a $70 price land, is feasibly viable forestry land. Okay. Now, if you ask, if Wrightson's put out the rural report a couple of days ago, I think it's 26, and they commented upon the massive sales that are happening around beef and lamb at the moment to forestry, which accords exactly with what's happening up there. In fact, that price is a little bit lower. There's the changes happening early because it didn't take into account indigenous forests being used for carbon sequestration. So that has an impact on that value. So what that's telling you is that this price, all that beef and lamb and part of the dairy land under there is now prospectively a viable option for a forester and for the farmer, because you're better to grow trees now. You make more money growing forests to sequester than you will have beef and lamb. Now, this is back of the envelope economics, so don't hold me to it. But I had an economist look at it the other day. If you follow that up to 250, you see that the dairy also starts falling under there. Now, don't take this as a certain. This is a scenario, okay? And it was actually produced 2 years ago. But it tells you that there's a red flag there. So in your community, when you're looking at the climate change actions and you want to know what's going to impact on your community, this is the sort of information that's really valuable to you, because it says to you, I may have a different economic base in my community in 3 years' time than I have now. So I need to start thinking about what actions do I take to support that future community, or support a transition, or maintain that current community so that we don't undergo change. I'm not having the answers for you, but this, again, take this as just an example of how you look for red flags when you're doing an assessment of what actions do you start feeding into your pathway. Okay, so that was probably a very deep dive into something, but just to, again, just an example. And we've gone over time.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, that probably, did you have any questions or anything as we got along there? A lot of information to take in.
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, thanks, it was a fascinating presentation. I mean, it's a handful of dairy farmers and farmers sitting around the table, so clearly we've all got a bit of skin in the game.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess there's clearly some really crazy unintended consequences of this kind of economic model, right? And I guess at what point do we place value on food creation? Because to the best of my knowledge, you can't eat trees. So I appreciate what you're saying, and I appreciate the science, but I guess that's quite a terrifying looking model as a dairy farmer.
Absolutely.
So yeah, and I accept that from a council perspective, we've got another set of obligations and train too. But we are dairy farmers, we are farmers, we all have friends who are farmers. So and it does so significantly underpin the economy of our district. So this has potential to be really far-reaching. And whilst I talk, I hear you saying, how can we support people to transition? I'm saying, well, we still can't eat trees. So I guess that's sort of where the rubber hits the road a little bit, Yeah.
And they're a really important thing. I mean, this is, as I said, it's a red flag to say, okay, what is the real problem here that we have to deal with? Like, how do we deal with it? If that's don't take that as a certainty, as I said. But if we're looking at a carbon price that's going to affect our land use and land use change, like, how is a community? That's where your focus needs to be. It's not on, like Melanie was saying, not saying you don't do this, but you don't put an EV on every corner and go, we've done our bit for climate change, because that's not where the issues are coming from. So what I guess we're getting at is trying to help you actually focus on the really important things for you as a community. I don't have the answers, but we know that it's an issue.
So when there's an economic incentive for farmers to undertake this, and it's privately owned land, they can do what they want, And I mean, look at the East Coast, East Cape, out towards, Hawke's Bay Way. I mean, and probably all over the country. And it's really concerning, because I can understand the short-term benefit, as Phil sort of suggested, there's if you've got a check dangling in front of you, it's pretty rough when you're faced with increased regulation left, right and centre, and so all the challenges you have as a farmer. It's pretty tempting to take that check, isn't it? But I guess the longitudinal ripple effect of that, going almost centuries in, will be massive.
It's really hard too, because there's, like I said at the beginning, there are some certainties. Like, New Zealand is not a big enough country to stop this trajectory. Like, we're one of the small players. Like, we all know that we're one of the small players. But that's I hate to say it, it's not being hard. Like, it's sort of the reality of what's coming down, and it has to be addressed at some point. But you know, it's not without hope. That's not, you know, you're right. We do have to produce food. So there's got to be a solution in there. And we talk about, like, don't look at it as a risk and freeze up and say, oh, we're going to lose the farm. It's so much as, like, how do we continue to meet that demand, but maybe in a different way, you know. But that's not, you know, I'm not going to go into that business. I don't know, but you know, again, it's a consideration.
It's a real challenge. Challenge.
Huge.
I think it's. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. I mean, thanks for your presentation, but yeah, my personal view on these farms for carbon credits, I just totally disagree with it. I mean, yeah, you're dangling all this money, and yes, in the short term they'll be making more money out of it, but the world is growing, the population is growing, we've got to feed them, and this land, which is as steep as that, which is going into carbon forestry, still produces a product. It produces a store land, which a flatter farm then flattens up. And, you know, we can farm in New Zealand and produce something and send it to the other side of the world way better environmentally and cheaper than on the other side of the world. And, you know, farmers are doing the business to look after their waterways and all that sort of stuff, and husbandry. What are McDonald's doing? What are Burger King doing? I have a big road frontage at home, and I'm always picking up fast food stuff. What are they doing about planting trees and all that sort of stuff? And I will say, you know, I mean, forestry farming for timber, fully support that, but not for carbon credits. You know, there's a bit of employment to put the trees in and get things going over the first couple of years, but it's not sustainable. It doesn't produce long-term employment once those trees are in. I mean, my cousins have got a big farm out of Carfi and just done a part of it, and I love them dearly, but I don't support what they're doing, and I don't support any of this personally. Yeah.
There's many aspects of this. So, for example, like, we're trying to bring our emissions down. In New Zealand, we've got, you know, 41% is ag, well, it's ag, is methane. No, 41% is ag, and 48% is energy. So the government has taken a line, taken the road where if we can get all our energy down to 100%, we actually don't have to go very hard on it. So that's why, you know, government's doing things like the Onslow Dam in the South Island to try and, even though that's not financially viable as such, but it'll help us get 100% electricity, which will lower our emissions, so we don't have to go so hard on that. And I know government's looking at those sorts of
New Zealand had, you know, we saw it with COVID. You know, when there was all those lockdowns and stuff all around the world, you saw the pollution levels drop dramatically, and everyone was still farming. And, you know, the issue is, the real issue, you know, what do we produce? 0.5% or something, don't we, in this country? The real issue is in India and China and all those sorts of stuff. And they have all these COP26 summits, they have all these, you know, it's a bit like us and our jobs, you know, we can't just be talking about it, we've got to be doers. And, you know, all those leaders around the world get together and say they're going to do all this stuff and talk about it, but they don't actually do it. So I guess, you know, the real issue is more in those countries. You know, we've got all these waterways, that we've got all these hydroelectric power station, which is, you know, it's all sustainable, it's virtually zero environmental. Okay.
Anyway, I apologise. I certainly didn't mean to trigger anyone, and I probably got the wrong example. But again, it's a flag, you know,
absolutely
to think about. I really want, what we're hoping is that you don't waste your time focusing on things that aren't important, because there are a lot of distractions in this space, and focus on the things that you can actually do something about, you know, that are important.
Yeah, Claire, and then Lou.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Like, are you and, you know, your advisors able to provide councils with guidelines on, you know, emissions profiles for different parts of our community, which would help us identify the big emitters or the ones that are going to have real issues with transitioning that we might need to support and stuff like that. Is there any work being done on that, you know, at national level?
It's not freely available. The government is working with some of the Crown entities and NIWA to come up with a program to make more of this data available. The private sector, you know, it's not that they don't care what they pay, but they're willing to pay. But the problem is the information is not out there. Some of that, a lot of that information actually is out there, and yes, we can help bring it together. But there are some data gaps. So that's one of the big problems. And we may be a couple of years away before we get that data. But yeah, we can help you with that data. I would say, like, understand what your targets and your pathways are, and then once you've got that sorted out, and you know, as a council, then you can start delving in and making sure you're sort of getting your best bang for your buck when you're looking for that information. But you're right. Like if you look at those actions and you know what are the community impacts of having action A, you absolutely should be looking into that and not just choosing it because it sounds like it's it's a good thing.
Lou.
Claire was actually right along the same line, because your initial statement was the lack of data, and that to us is going to be the critical thing, because we're a reasonably small TA, and we do find that very difficult to create that sort of data within our own area. I'll just make one or two minor comments. Is there investigation in carbon sequestration on pastures, for example? There is some work being done on that, and that should be one of the things that we quantify. I would also say that the planting or ad hoc planting of exotic forests has a big problem for us as territorial authorities, on the grounds that we would see a dislocation of a lot of those rural communities and the urban drift, which would put pressure on a lot of things that we have now. So, and we'd have to create more infrastructure in an urban environment. So that has got to be taken into consideration as well. I mean, and my final thing was that exotic forests actually has what they call Achilles heel, and they have to be harvested at 30 years. And the carbon sequestration at 30 years is actually released again. So we have got some problems with that, and they sit for what? It's 5 to 6 years before you can actually get another set of planting in and start to actually decrease the carbon. So I'll leave it with you, mate.
No, the big concern is that those production forest owners will be walking off their land and leaving it in production forest because they get more from the credits from leaving the tree. Big issue. And as I said, we're both from this area. Like we both, neither of us want to see Te Awamutu or Cambridge or Hopewell, disappear as a community. Like it's.
I think as well, when you're talking about there's a whole lot of work around that supporting nature, but also about that real focus on nature-based opportunities. And there's work going on in developing carbon markets and things like peat and things like that in terms of that. So there are some really good opportunities there now. And I think as well, talking to the farming, one of the principles and the themes under that emissions reduction plan is about high quality exports and innovation. And so, if you feel like this is an area where the opportunity is actually that you're going to be a core food producer or a core whatever producer, then perhaps the opportunity that comes out of that is looking at the high quality export and innovation, and you're probably already doing some of that. But I think it's turning it around to look at what those opportunities are, and in those areas that aren't in dairy or beef, can we have opportunities for our economy where we're doing nature-based solutions in areas where we can be making some money out of that. So there are some possibilities.
And then, we're working on it. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, wait.
I was going to say we're working on a carbon neutral government program, which you may not have heard much about, but that's the central government said it's got to offset all its emissions. That's a massive exercise, huge. But we've just started doing the work on that to look what does that mean, and part of that is sequestration. In peat, in that land that's not the high value land, to try and find those options, wetlands.
So just on that, some years ago I had the great pleasure of attending the Environmental Defence Society conference and heard Dr. Rosie Bosworth speak. And her theory was that New Zealand needed to become the Swiss Army knife of food producers, and that the whole notion of becoming the top rung of dairy producers and beef producers, and capturing that market, not being concerned so much about the rise of synthetics, because the rise in population of the globe will require more food anyway. But yeah, she pitched a really interesting and somewhat terrifying at the same time proposition to those attending. And I guess in part you kind of have to a little bit in terms of disclosing that potential economic model, but really challenging for us as a district, definitely going forward. Anyway, Graham wanted to add something.
Mark, just wanted to pick you up on one of the things you talked about right at the start. 21% of New Zealanders never had clean drinking water.
No, sorry.
No, let me finish.
Sorry, go ahead.
There was a lot of porkies told when the 3 Water Strategy came out. For example, the minister was saying 34,000 people were affected, and they were figures from London in 2014. Mm-hmm. We did a bit of homework, and there was actually 337 people who potentially had stomach complaints from water. And here's the rub. Not one of those complaints was from a council water supply.
Yeah.
So we're being very, very smudgy with some of the things that we're hearing, and it's one of those things to the community that hasn't gone down well at all. Yeah,
and it's a good point. You get down in the detail, and and it can look like a different story.
That's really the point that I took out of your comments. It's critical that we've got good data when we're making these decisions, because to go wildly down one direction, planting all of our farmland in trees, as you've touched on, Susan, this morning, it's extreme measures, isn't it? We've got to have the data before we actually start making these decisions. Otherwise, we will be wasting a lot of time and effort.
At the moment, Germany's opening all its coal mines up. The gas from Russia's been cut off, so they're opening all their coal mines up.
Yeah.
So yeah, to your point, Jim, I wrote, as you were talking, evidence-based decision-making and directing resource appropriately. Find out what is impactful and what's going to be helpful. Has someone else done it before us, and what can we learn from them? Sort of is what I took out largely from what you've said, Melanie. But I think the need for data and have that data be, agreed to. And that agreed response.
It's really
is important.
Councils we're working with, many councils we've spoken to are the same. We've got a low budget, or we've got limited ability to allocate resources to this. But actually, there's an immense amount of data amongst the different councils, and there's certainly a willingness from our conversation to share that information. I'm not really sure why that's not happening, and maybe it's just.
I think also
around to it all.
It's also having, I guess, when you're going out, getting that data and creating it, if you're looking at sharing and collaborating, it's also making sure there's consistency. So if you're starting a new plan to gather in data, if you're wanting to share it so that within your region, you can all get a bit of a picture, it's kind of working with those people and collaborating to make sure you do have consistency, so it's comparable and you actually have a real and appropriate picture.
But if you want to know more about that, we can. I mean, as I said, this is another aspect of what we do, so we can certainly some future time talk to you about it. It's going to be helpful.
Jim.
Through you, Madam Chair, I'm really interested in, I suppose with time, we haven't got it today, but and probably Melanie, your maybe area of expertise is I suppose the financial and legal implications that we're facing if we're assuming this is going to happen, and the number of claims that we're likely to be facing as an industry, local government industry, not necessarily just Waipara, in terms of how do we handle people who have unfortunately constructed their dwellings in flood-prone areas or fire risk areas or whatever it may be. And just, I know there is some work being done at the moment on just how to handle this moving into the future, but with the insurance industry backing off, probably the banking industry not lending on some of these high-risk properties, is going to have a significant impact on our community that we need to be working on as well.
That transition is really important.
And it was interesting, I was talking to someone the other day who was working on they're a surveyor working on some developments, not in this area, in Whirianga, I think, and the developments they're working on have been moved so they're on a slightly higher area of town because the rest of it's low. But we were saying, okay, but from a disaster perspective, if you had inundation, of that flat area, that's where the bulk of your infrastructure is also for that town. So you're left with a part of a development which is sitting on the side of a floodplain where all the infrastructure is. And so how is that being taken into account? So although in some of the spatial planning, they're thinking differently as to, okay, now we'll move some of these properties up into safer areas. Where's the bulk of the infrastructure and the services that those people rely on? And yeah, so it's some of the thinking around that, those crossovers between these transition, managing the climate impacts, the physical impacts, and, you know, all that inundation and that type of thing.
Fantastic. Look, lots of massive meaty issues there to have to address going forward. But look, thank you so much, both of you, for your very thought-provoking presentation today. But I think we'll leave that there. We've had a bit of a reorder of our agenda because we've just been talking way too much.